Hello, everyone. I'll be your host for today. I am introducing Nuno Sepúlveda, who is a former Ramsay Grant program researcher. I've actually had the pleasure of working with Nuno at our previous jobs at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where his interest in ME began after collaborating with the Cure ME group to perform statistical analyses of the UK ME CFS biobank. Now at the Warsaw University of Technology in the Faculty of Mathematics and Information Science, where he is the head of the Immune Stats group, whose mission is to find biomarkers and diagnostics for ME and other complex diseases. In Warsaw, he lives with his lovely wife, Anna, and their beautiful little boy, Arthur. I'll hand it over to you now, Nuno.
Good morning for you guys. Good evening for myself. I'm currently in Warsaw. The day was hot, but not as hot as in Portugal. Well, actually, I'm from. Today in Warsaw was 26 degrees, but in my hometown, Lisbon, is 43 degrees Celsius. So it's huge. My sister was texting me before our seminar, saying that it's unbearable. So people have to stay home and a lot of fires. And without further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research on herpes virus and related to ME/CFS patients. And I will start to say that I think my background is a little bit unusual because my academic background is actually mathematics and statistics. So I did my PhD in theoretical immunology, where I actually study some theories of the immune system and how the immune system actually distinguish what is self and non-self, mostly. And this is the basis of of autoimmune diseases. Okay, so when I start digging a little bit more on ME/CFS, and it was interesting to see there was an autoimmune hypothesis. So that's why I ended up doing more research on the disease. Okay. So I started with this is probably some of you know this cartoon, and I don't want to bring this again, but ME/CFS patients, they've been victim of neglect and stigma over the years, and this is a little bit like a brief history from the 70s until 2022. But what I want to emphasize in this cartoon is that in 2000s, there's this sentence that it says, "I've been horribly ill after an infection, so I'm sending you to a mental hospital." So mostly what I'm going to talk about is a lot about ME/CFS patients that actually reported infections, okay? And this is mostly the findings that I'm going to bring it to you, okay? And before I go to the science, I just wanted to bring you this, like a little bit, my scheme. This is the way I more or less operate. And I think that medicine can be divided in like four pillars. One is how to prevent, another one how to diagnose, another one is how to treat, and how to cure, okay? And in all of these steps, you need to have research. And in this research, you can develop new diagnostic tools, improve new treatments, innovate in the treatments and in prevention. The problem is with this system, exactly with these steps, that nothing works on ME/CFS because we kind of stuck in the first step from prevention to diagnose. We cannot diagnose, the ME/CFS apart from excluding diseases that explain fatigue and some key symptoms. That leads to a lot of misclassification, and then I will talk about a little bit about this in a few slides forward. So as you know, no biomarker available for ME/CFS, so no surprise. And another thing that is also probably you guys all know is that the cause is unknown, but the patients report there's possible triggers. They don't know exactly the cause, but it could be, chronic stress, it could be related to work, to personal life, and even pregnancy. Then you can have infections, bacterial, parasites, and viruses. So when actually you put all of this together, you see that this disease is very complex just by looking at this, reported disease triggers. Okay. So my mission in all of this is actually to partition the problem in more manageable, tasks. So what I did mostly is to focus on reported disease triggers related to viruses, okay, which includes coronavirus. But even just including just thinking about virus, and this should be, everyone should be aware of, there are 219 virus species that can infect humans. So how can you do that? How can you make sense in all of this when you're actually doing research on CFS? Okay, I just listed a few, species here, coronavirus, that are, that can be related to long COVID. Arboviruses that actually people don't talk a lot about it, but arboviruses are like interesting because they are like Zika, they are dengue, chikungunya, and they are from the tropical countries. And most of the research in ME/CFS is actually in, let's say, Western world. So actually, I believe, and this is that a lot of ME/CFS patients are in Africa, because you can have these people that actually that were in outbreaks, like a Zika outbreak in Cape Verde, Zika outbreak and dengue outbreak in Brazil, and so on and so forth. So you can have patients everywhere in the world with a different virus. Then you have the typical influenza, the filovirus that probably it's Ebola and Marburg virus that are very nasty. And mostly they are not causing ME/CFS because they are so nasty. It just, it's just a fact that the lethality is very high. So that leads us to this herpes virus. And why herpes virus in specifically? When you're talking about, arbovirus is actually, it needs to have a host, before infecting humans, and you need mosquitoes in that case. So you don't have like everyone that is infected with arbovirus. But in the case of herpes virus, all of us, almost like 90% of the human population, is infected at the current moment with these viruses. The question is that if these viruses are active or not, and this is more or less the idea of ME/CFS, or the application of these viruses in ME/CFS research. There is an idea that actually these viruses, they are so common that when in certain circumstances they are chronic, and that become active at some point. And what happens is that patients experience these infections, and this can lead to symptoms of persistent fatigue because you have persistent reactivation of these viruses. Okay, so the herpes virus, from the point of view of research, they are the most, let's say, the obvious candidates, first self-reported cases, right? And on top of that is because they are in all of us. Okay, so I'm going to focus on herpes, Epstein-Barr virus, herpes simplex virus, or type 1 and type 2, and cytomegalovirus, and varicella-zoster virus, and human herpes virus 6. This Kaposi sarcoma associated virus, it belongs to this, this species of viruses, but I'm not going to talk about that. But I think there is data, available from the UK ME/CFS biobank that actually screened for these viruses in patients in the UK. So just bearing that in mind. So what's actually the purpose of my talk? So my purpose of my talk is just to do to give you an idea of what is serology analysis and what I did in this serology analysis. So serology analysis is a fancy word for analysis of the antibodies that a person has at a given time point. Okay, and usually when you do research on ME/CFS, you have what we call, statistically speaking, a case control study design. So you recruit healthy individuals, and then you recruit patients, and you compare the amount of different antibodies against these viruses and check if they are different, statistically speaking. Okay, so this is the basic idea. Okay, so I'm not going to give you, the overview, historical overview of the herpes virus research, but I just wanted to highlight this fact that if you go back to the literature, there's conflicting evidence about the role of herpes virus in ME/CFS. And I start reading the literature, and I start reading between the lines, and I hinted, or I understood, that the conflict evidence is coming from two sources of problems. One is that I call foundational problems, is that ME/CFS patients don't have a biomarker to be diagnosed. So there's a possibility of a misdiagnosis, okay? Second is that patients are so different from each other that naturally the disease is very heterogeneous, okay? So the cohorts can be just different, okay? A third one is actually the definition of healthy controls. And this is something that everyone needs to think about this. Now that you think about obesity, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome that have, such a high prevalence in the human population, that what we consider healthy individuals, okay? So the definition of healthy controls is a little bit loose in the literature, and sometimes the recruitment is not random, it's biased. For example, people, studies just recruit the staff that are available in the hospital, for example, okay? So it's not a random sample of a population when these study designs actually require, okay? And of course, this is a problem that all researchers in ME/CFS have been struggling with, which is about funding and the impact of lack of funding in the sample size. So the research is conducted in reduced sample sizes, and this leads to poor statistical power. It means that you cannot reproduce these results well, okay? Then you have what I call technical reasons, which is more related, not so interesting for you guys, but this is kind of things that we have to put in the papers, but it's about technical reasons. It's about, if you have a study conducted in a given lab, is it the same as conducting the same assay in another lab? It's not the same. And then if you actually compare studies A, study B, and actually they have different assays, okay? Different antigens, they're not the same. So when actually the claim is saying there's no evidence that there is difference between cases and controls, you need to be aware of this problem. The studies are not comparable in terms of the lab assays, okay? So you need to be very careful. And when we talk about antibodies, and this is I don't know if everyone knows this, but antibodies, they recognize parts of proteins, okay? And this is in immunological term, is called antigen. So when actually you do the lab assay, you should say what is the antigen that this assay is trying to recognize, that the antibodies are recognizing. But actually they say a BNA or a protein A, and actually the antibodies are not to that protein, is part of the protein, okay? So it's also different antigens. And then this is something that is very dear to me. When actually you go to the literature, the statistical analysis of such a complex disease, for me, is too simple. Okay, basically they are tests that they're not very advanced, and they don't take advantage of what's happening in the data. So my mission in my group now, with all these slides, is actually since I don't do lab experiments and I don't do recruitment, is actually my contribution to the field is to reanalyze published data. Okay, to see if actually you can extract a little bit more, because I think we can go a little bit further even with the data that we have, okay? And so I bring you two stories. I hope that I'll be on time, but the first story is about UK ME/CFS biobank, okay, that Kate already alluded in introduction. We worked together in this biobank, okay? And another story is about a German cohort that was collected in the Charité in Berlin, okay? Same study designs, case control, and the objective is to compare the antibody levels of healthy controls against the patients, okay? So let's go to the first story, okay? So this story is actually this this study was published in 2019, so before the pandemics. And actually the objective was to screen the immunology phenotypes of a lot of cells. So the objective of this study was not serology, was not the antibodies. But I just wanted to highlight this fact that, okay, so what they did by design is actually they extended a little bit the design, so it was case control, but the patients were subdivided in moderate symptoms or mild and moderate, so 175 patients, and other patients that had severe symptoms, mostly homebound or bedbound. Okay, so this was the kind of like stratification that they use in this study. Actually, I was part of this, but I was doing something else. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the data in this like a fancy plot, which we call a density plot. So you have on the x-axis the amount of the antibodies in blood samples. So now I'm just summarizing what I have in the samples. Okay, so I have a distribution. So you have on the y-axis the probability of having a certain antibody level. Okay, so what I want you guys just to focus without being too technical is that if these curves are similar, it means there is no difference between these groups. Okay, so we screened. So in the beginning of this study, serology was done as almost like, let's say, a background data, was not the objective. So they screened for antibodies against cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr, varicella zoster virus, herpes simplex 1 and 2, varicella zoster, and that's it. So they are like 6 around that. Okay, so now you can see that the data of cytomegalovirus, and now you see these 3 curves, they are more or less the same. Okay, statistically speaking, they are the same. Okay, so if you go to Epstein-Barr, and now the antigen is this VCA, is a viral capsid antigen. Doesn't matter for now, but it's related to the recognition of the envelope of the virus, I think. So you don't see any difference between healthy controls and patients when they are divided in this severity of symptoms. Okay. The same for Epstein-Barr's on AB and A1, human herpes virus 6, herpes simplex virus 1. So you see that the curves are more or less the same. I just don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Herpes simplex virus 2, okay? And varicella zoster virus that are like this, okay? So at this moment, the conclusion that we put in the paper was that now that, now I'll give you a little bit more technical, that in this dashed line over here is what we call a threshold for seropositivity. Probably you heard about this in the news about coronavirus testing, that when you exceed a certain amount of antibodies, but actually you're not measuring antibodies, you're actually measuring in light intensity. So if light intensity exceeds a certain level, you assume that you have enough antibodies to say that people are seropositive, okay? So in the end, what we calculate is the prevalence of individuals that have a certain amount that actually are seropositive, and we call it seroprevalence. And this is what I show you here. I don't want to bother you with the table, but this is, I just want you to focus on the last 6 rows of this table. So viral serology studies, and you have all this data that I showed you before, okay? And then you have this percentage, the free N and the percentage. The percentage is actually the seroprevalence. And in the end, you have the last column, you have the p-value. So the p-value is a measure of the statistical significance of your difference between the groups. And actually, when actually the p-value is greater than 0.05, it means that the groups are similar. So at this moment, we published this, and there was no difference between ME/CFS patients by severity of symptoms and healthy controls. We had an additional control group, which were multiple sclerosis patients. But for now, it's not important for you guys to focus on that. So this is the MS patient that is there in one of the columns, okay? So at this moment, you don't see any difference. So nothing interesting, right? So what I did is actually, for me, it's hard to believe that there is no difference in antibodies levels. We are just not looking, we're not doing the right thing. So what I did, I asked Ileana Lacerda and I think Kate, maybe it was there at that time, to provide me the disease triggers of these patients. So, what I did was, my team did some kind of like very rough division of patients according to their disease streams. So you have now, instead of having two groups divided in severity, now I forget about severity because severity doesn't affect the antibodies, it seems like. And now you have 42 patients that actually have, they don't know what were the disease triggers, so don't know what is the cause. Then you have 43 patients that actually, they think they didn't have any infection. So it could be stress-related, the stress-related disease trigger. And then you have two groups related to infections. So the first group, which is the majority, is that patients that they self-reported an infection, but the test, they didn't do a test to confirm if that infection was actually there, okay? And then in the last group is actually patients that they say they had an infection and it was lab confirmed, okay? So now you have 4 groups of ME/CFS patients. Here is just for you to guys have an idea of the self-reported disease triggers. And I just wanted to highlight, so for the unknown, they don't know the triggers, so there's no groups, but S1, S2, S3 are these groups that have non-infection trigger, infection trigger with no lab confirmation, and the third group, S3, is actually the patients with an infection trigger confirmed with a lab test. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight this fact. So in the S3 group, you had a lot of people that actually reported glandular fever, tonsillitis, and an EBV infection. Okay, so it seems like there was something there. Another interesting for me, because at that time I was in the London School of Tropical Medicine, I found actually people that reported tropical infections. Okay, and actually they reported schistosomiasis and malaria. Okay, we don't know if it was true or not, but there's. And then you have other stressors like anxiety, stress due to personal events, stress at work or school, vaccination, which is kind of like an infection, immunologically speaking, chemical exposure, accidents, and so on and so forth. Okay, just for you guys to have an idea. So now I replotted the data, and I don't want to, go to the details of the statistical analysis. I just wanted to show you the data. So now what you see here is that when I subdivided the patients in these 4 groups, now you see that the group S3, which is the infection with the lab confirmed, is actually in a cytomegalovirus, actually have low antibodies for cytomegalovirus, okay? And the rest of the groups are more or less the same, okay? When you go to Epstein-Barr virus, this specific antigen, VCA, okay, now you can see that, interestingly, if we focus on the orange line, okay, you have actually the patients with a non-infection trigger, so stress, more or less stress-related triggers, they actually have lower antibodies against this Epstein-Barr virus antigen, okay, and the rest are more or less the same. So when you actually do, and then you go for the rest of the data, and I'm just already going to say to you, no difference. So Epstein-Barr virus ABNA1, nothing, you don't see any difference. So the curves are all the same. Human herpes virus 6, the same. Herpes simplex virus 1, see the beautiful, they almost coincided in all of them. Herpes virus simplex 2 and varicella zoster virus, okay? So the take-home message in all of this is that by stratifying the patients according to their disease triggers, you find different things, okay? So in the case of this infection group confirmed in the lab, it seems like they have lower antibodies against cytomegalovirus, okay? Then when you go to another group, which is the group with the ME/CFS patients with a non-infection trigger, it seems like you have lower levels of antibodies against this VCA antigen of the Epstein-Barr, okay? And then the rest, they don't provide you any other information. So in a way, is that the data is out there. Seems like there is no difference between healthy controls and patients, but when you're smart in terms of how you stratify the patients, you start getting sense of this, okay? Okay, so this is something that I'm personally interested in. So is it possible that these differences that I highlighted here in red, are they possible to be used as a biomarker for these patients, for these specific subgroups, okay? And bear with me, this is a cutoff for positivity. I just wanted to see if the result could be, it was robust to the choice of the cutoff for the seropositivity. So I did the analysis for all this varying cutoff, okay? And this AUC is a metrics, how good is your classification of patients and healthy controls. So the higher the better. Don't need to go to the details of the metrics, but what it means that if you have value 1, it means that you have perfect classification of patients. If you have 0.5, it means that your classification is like random, so it's not useful, okay? So I highlighted here for this group ME/CFS patients of non-infection trigger, and I put it the best classification that I could go. And actually this the AUC curve, the area under the curve, this AUC, is actually doesn't go beyond 65%. So it's not very good. Statistically speaking, there is difference, but it seems like the classification of patients is not very good. So when actually you're going to this, the other group, ME/CFS patients with infection trigger, with a confirmed, confirmed in the lab, did the same. Now focus just on the black line, which is the difference between healthy controls and this group, which is the CMV. So this classification is around 65%. So it's not very good. So it means that at this stage, you have some statistical significant results, but at the same time, these antibodies that were used, they were not useful for patient classification, okay? So the summary of this story is that you can get significant results with adequate stratification of patients, first of all. Then you can find decreased antibody response in different subsets of ME/CFS patients, okay? But this antibody response, at the moment, they cannot be used as a biomarker. And one of the reasons is that these lab assays, they detect any antigen on these proteins that they actually detect, that they are targeting. So you don't know what is the antigen that they actually recognize. So this comes to the second story. The second story is actually, can we find a biomarker hidden in more specific antibody response against this herpes virus? Because these assays, they just recognize antibodies a lot with different antigens. They are there, just there, but you want to be more specific. So this is what this beautiful study of Carmen Schebenbogen from Berlin, she did. So this is a case control study, 50 healthy individuals against 92 ME/CFS patients recruited in a Charité. Okay, this data was published in 2017. So publicly available, it was wonderful because I could just analyze at my own will, right? Not being stuck to what was in the paper, okay? And just to give you a little bit, a briefly overview of what is the data like, okay? So besides to have the patients, you actually, in these patients, they screen the antibody response against more than 3,000 peptides against EBV, EBV proteins. Okay, so these peptides, I mean antigens, is another way. Antigen peptides, a bit the same. Sorry about if the terminology sometimes change, but these peptides are derived from 14 EBV proteins, and they are these proteins, they are representative of different functions in the virus. but mostly these proteins are related to latency. So it means to the chronicity of the infection itself, okay? Okay, so just give you what's actually what they found in the paper, okay? So this is the sum of the signals for all these antibodies, right? So each dot is actually a patient. So if you focus on the left-hand side plot, so now you can see healthy controls, CFS patients, and they also include a multiple sclerosis patients, just as an additional control, but not important for now. But they found out that the overall antibody response was increased in CFS patients when compared to healthy controls. And this is what is represented by this one star on top of this plot, okay? This is actually when you compare these two groups, okay? The statistical significance was not great. So it was around 0.01, 0.05 and 0.01. So it's not like very strong results. So when actually you go to the EBNA1, that actually I presented in the first story, actually you don't see any difference in the between healthy controls and CFS patients, okay? Of course, in these plots, the multiple sclerosis patients, they have a very strong immune response against Epstein-Barr virus. And then we can discuss this in the end. So they go a little bit further, and they discover that actually they could pinpoint some increased antibody reactivity to these EBNA6 peptides in ME/CFS patients, and they are in this. So these are the protein sequences of these peptides, that are related to this protein. So I don't want to bother you much about this, but what it shows this plot is actually there's increased antibody response to these peptides in chronic fatigue patients in relation to controls. Okay, and at this stage, I thought they did a good job, but I think with such an amazing data resource of 3,000 antibodies, I thought this would be the perfect case to see if it was possible to develop a biomarker based on this data. Okay, and this is kind of what I did. I'm just going to skip this slide. So what my question when I reanalyzed this data was, can we find a biomarker among these 3,000 antibody response? Okay, so this is coming a little bit more complex. So that's why I'm telling you that the statistical analysis becomes a little bit more tricky, not because you need to repeat a lot the analysis, not like summing all the antibody response. And what I did is actually I did similar stratification of the patients. So I got in touch with Professor Carmen Chaman-Bogan and asked if there was information about the disease triggers. And she said that actually there's most of the patients had an infection trigger, some of them with EBV, but not all of them. And other patients, they had a non-infection trigger or an unknown trigger, okay? So what I did is to do a biomarker discovery exercise comparing healthy controls against all patients and then healthy controls against these different subgroups. Okay, so now bear with me because this is a plot that actually is used a lot in genetics. And so what is this is telling you the statistical significance when you compare healthy controls against all patients in terms of this antibody response. And this is on the y-axis is the minus log 10 p-value. So now you want a very high this very high value of this quantity to become statistically significant. You have a lot of statistical tests that you need to run, 3,000 to be more precise, and you need to correct for a problem called multiple testing. So this is what I did here. So in this dashed line I put it, this is correcting for multiple testing, just to, to be, to have like a global significant level of 5%. So not just want to have this in mind. Okay, so all the points that are above this line, they are considered statistically significant. And again, this is a situation that I got in the first study. So if I have all patients, nothing is statistically significant. Okay. So when actually you do the sub-analysis or subgroup analysis, and actually now you can see that there's some statistical significant results in the patients with an infection trigger. And you actually can find 3 antibody response against these peptides: EBNA 666 or 66, ABNA 670. So actually they are peptides that they overlap with each other. Okay, so they have more or less the same sequence. That's why they were picked up. Okay, and this EBNA 4529. Okay, so this is the perfect setting to construct the biomarker, because you don't have to screen a lot of antibodies. You just need to screen these ones. Okay, but before going that, so when I do the analysis for the remaining patients, nothing comes up. So again, patients with infection trigger, they are different in terms of antibody response, which is kind of expected, but that it's nice that the analysis is telling you this, you know. So in this case, you have actually in this ME/CFS patients, the antibody responses for these different antibodies, they are increased. Okay, this is what is shown here in these box plots, you know. Okay, so when I did kind of like a classifier using these peptides and see if actually you could predict healthy controls and patients. And this is something that is very dear for statisticians. It's called the ROC curve. And actually you plot the false positives against the true positives, and you change the threshold. That's why you have these lines. But for now, what is important is that these 3 lines represent the 3 analysis, the overall analysis and the 2 subgroup analysis. Okay, and what you want to have is that these curves need to be closer to this, you know, corner on the left, the point 0.01 on the left hand corner. Okay, so that's the perfect classification of the patients. Okay, so the best classification that I got, not surprising, is when I compare healthy controls against ME/CFS with an infection trigger, and this AUC is around 83% or 84%, and when actually you see the upper limit of the confidence interval actually can go to 92%, 91%. So it's actually, they're not perfect, but it seems like you have a possibility to actually classify these patients according to these antibodies. Okay, but not in the other groups. When you do all patients, nothing. It's the classification is better than in the first story, but it's not perfect. And when actually you compare the healthy controls against ME/CFS with a non-infection or unknown, it's almost like completely random, the classification. So no biomarker potential for this data. So again, summary 2 is that the significant results were obtained with adequate stratification of patients. Obvious one is just infection versus non-infection. Okay, in this case, you have increased antibody response in ME/CFS patients with an infection trigger. Okay, and I guess in this case there is a biomarker potential of this antibody response, for at least for this subgroup. Okay, not for all the patients. So I will almost at the end. So I'm just going to give you the final remarks and just putting you this in a perspective. Okay, so I think I tried to convince you that stratification is key, and you probably, if you go to the literature, you know, Jason, I think Leonard Jason is already proposed that the ME/CFS patient should be subtyped in a way. Okay, so this is not a novel idea, but this shows you that the power of stratification can provide you much more information than just doing the analysis blindly. Okay, at this stage we are a little bit limited by this dichotomy of infection trigger against non-infection trigger or unknown in this case. In both cases, actually, you can see herpesvirus antibody signature, which is interesting. So in the case of an infection trigger, you can have this broad CMV antibody response that are decreased in ME/CFS patients from the UK. And when actually you go through the German cohort, you actually can find specific EBV antibodies that provide you that signature, okay? In the case of non-infection trigger patients, actually you can have this almost like a broad VCA antibody response, which is not very, for me, is not very informative. So I put this like a question mark on this. Maybe in this group, the serology biomarkers are not the way forward. Maybe we should pursue non-serological biomarkers, okay? Okay, so I just want to finish with another 2 slides. One is this cautionary note on reproducibility. And again, coming back to these foundational problems or technical problems, the reanalysis could control some of these problems, but they cannot control everything, okay? So I just wanted to highlight that in my reanalysis, I still have the problem of misdiagnosed, okay? But at least I could control a little bit of the disease heterogeneity because of this stratification strategy. The definition of healthy controls is tricky. Actually, in the German cohort, the healthy controls were recruited from staff. So again, healthy controls can be the leaders of these results, is something to think about. Reduce sample sizes, because this is just a reanalysis, so I stick to what's the sample size of the original studies. And this is to put another item, which is, for me, it's necessary to do ME/CFS research with a cohort for validation. And unfortunately, I don't have that. So I cannot claim this. But at this moment, we are trying to, we have some results of additional cohorts, especially for these 3 antibody responses. Okay, technical reasons. The 2 studies, and the 2 studies, the one in the UK and the one in Germany, they are from different serological assays, so they are not compatible at all, okay? So this is a problem. They use different antigens, okay? But the German one is more specific. So I tend to believe that this is the way forward. You need to have more specific in the antibody response. And I didn't tackle this, but I try to go beyond simple statistical analysis, so I develop a little bit more advanced statistical methods along the way. So finally, I just want to highlight this fact. There is a contradiction between the results of the 2 studies, okay? In the UK Biobank, there is decreased antibody reactivity to herpesvirus. In the case of the German, you actually have the opposite. You have increased antibody response to EBV. So one of the reasons that I didn't have time to go through, but this is about disease duration. So first of all, the patients in the UK, they are older, and they have disease durations that are actually longer. In Germany, they are younger, and the disease duration is much shorter. So they're not comparable at all. Okay, so you need to take this with a grain of salt as well. So you see that the complexity is very high. Okay, so I'm just to finish off with the acknowledgements. I just want to thank my research group, especially to Tiago Domingos, who did some of the analysis of the first story, and João Malato for doing some analysis for the second story. Okay, I also would like to acknowledge this EuroMean network, so the European Network of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, and it provided me this opportunity to work with Professor Carmen Schemenbogen and Dr. Francisco Westermeier, and they are becoming not only collaborators but friends. And it's nice that we can collaborate with nice people that provide data, and they are eager to discuss their results. And of course, the Cure Me group, especially to Eliana, Luis, and of course Kate that is there, because they were exactly this idea of open data. Data is not hidden from the researchers, is actually open for everyone. Acknowledging in a way that we cannot know everything. Some people may know things much more than us. So let's provide the data so that everyone can analyze. And this is what they did. And for me, it was amazing. And lastly is just my host in Politechnica in Warsaw, Professor Przemek Biesek, and my funder from another agency here in Poland. And thank you for your attention. Thank you for having me. And I hope that you liked it. And there's some insights for the disease. And I open the floor for questions if you would like to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nuno. I always love hearing you talk, and I love how you make such complicated aspects of research easier to understand. I think you really put things in simpler terms, which is fantastic. So we have two sets of questions. We have some questions that came in before the webinar and some during the webinar. I'm going to start with one in particular before the webinar. This is about EBV reactivation. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what that looks like and how it can, as in how it can change over time. Should we be taking blood samples from patients when they're having a crash? Is it important to do it sooner when they first develop chronic fatigue syndrome?
Yeah, it's a good question. And probably you already know that this study was already conducted in the UK biobank data. So they were actually doing this follow-up. And I think this is the way it should be, because actually, if you do the follow-up over time, you increase the chance of trying to find to see if there is the same finding that you get, right? Because if it's just because of a crash, it's not a biomarker. So in a way. So, but reactivation is a little bit tricky in a way, because the antibodies that I analyzed, they are like memory antibodies. So they are not related to let's say, the reactivation itself. So they are IgG antibody response. Sorry, I think I got something here. My computer just got crazy. So I was saying that in a reactivation, you need to screen IgM. So they are not the same. So you have to also probably to screen for the viral material as well, PCR maybe. So what my presentation is much more like memory antibodies, because they are persistent. They should be more robust to the fluctuation of the symptoms. If you screen IgM, it's just going to recapitulate the fluctuation of the reactivation itself, if it makes sense. Okay, and so this case, that's why that if you want to find a biomarker, you need to invest on IgG, because they are memory, so they persist over time. Of course, one of the possibilities, and this is related to what I was telling you about, the disease duration, there's an idea that, with very long disease durations, the immune system of the patients will get exhausted. So, and the implication of that is that the antibody production or the antibodies cannot be maintained at a certain level. So they start decreasing. So they're becoming a little bit more immunological naive. So becoming more susceptible to infections again. And this helps reactivation, okay? Make sense?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm wondering then if you could talk a bit about sudden versus gradual onset of chronic fatigue syndrome, and if that is related to infection, if you had that information as well.
As far as I know, I think most of these infections, they are like a sudden infection, so that people remember. So I don't have the data, but I believe that these non-infection triggers are more like this gradual, kind of like building up over time. And then these groups that actually have an infection, because people can pinpoint in time when exactly happened, is like this sudden, disease onset. So, yeah. So and this is coming back to the antibodies. Of course, the gradual, and this is something that I could be talking here for a while, but chronic stress, if you think about it, I was very interested in one study that is not related to chronic fatigue syndrome, but actually was related to astronauts. And they screened for Epstein-Barr viruses in astronauts. And actually, when they are up there, they are under stress. So what happens? That they are persistently reactive. So if you think about this, as like you said, if a chronic stress is building up these antibodies over time. And if these antibodies actually, they are deleterious in a way, I didn't tell you about why they can be deleterious, right? Because what I think is that these antibodies, they cross-react with human proteins, so they becomes like an autoimmune disease, okay? So the chronic stress, it's actually, for me, is like this gradual building up of the antibody responses over time with reactivations that happen without you noticing. It's like, that you feel a bit like a sore throat, but it's nothing, but it's all persistently there. So for me, it was interesting, exactly this idea of the astronauts, that they have reactivation of herpes virus, mostly Epstein-Barr. So I believe that chronic stress can lead to something related to Ebv reactivation, So.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Nuno. I know for a fact the CureME group, they excluded people who were on antiviral treatment for this analyses. And that is because, if you could go into a little bit, the impact of being on antiviral treatment for the results of this.
Oh, of course, then you might have an impact on antibodies. So it's another it's another variable that you need to control. So in the analysis, I didn't say this, but when in all the statistical analysis, you need to adjust your results for different confounders. That's what we call in epidemiology. So and of course, treatment or medication can be one of the confounders, right? So to be more homogeneous, but of course, then you cannot compare these two groups, right? One with medication, another without medication. So probably you're not going to see the same results in people with medication.
That's right. Ovid, I wonder if you have any questions that you would like to add in at this point.
Yeah, first of all, Nuno, thank you for wonderful presentation. Maybe just a quick question is kind of, as we think about next steps, based on your analysis so far, what would be the ideal study, and what is the sample size? How many people do we need to include in a study like that? And if we could just for a moment design the ideal study, what would it look like?
I don't want to be very negative. I need to be very careful. But I must say that this study of the 3,000 antibody response, it's equivalent of screening genetic markers in a population, right? And most of these studies in genetics, they include thousands of people.
Right.
Okay. So I would say it's the same thing. And I would say with the aggravation, and this is that you have possibility of misclassification of patients. So you need to be aware of that. So it's like a chicken and egg problem, right? So if you cannot diagnose well, so you ended up always with this curse there. So, but my belief is that if you have, let's say, mild misclassification, if you have a lot of patients, this effect will be diluted. So I think long COVID in that sense, there's a big opportunity for understanding ME/CFS. First, all the people will have the same infection, which is great in the sense of researching, right? It's not great at all, but in terms of analysis, it's much people are more matched, and the sample size you're going to be, very big. You're going to have a lot of patients willing to participate. So, and probably the funders will also be happy to, to give money to have larger studies. So, but I think the take-home message in all of this is that the key is not so much about the sample size. The key is actually to understand these disease triggers, and then do the study design focus on those disease triggers. You cannot put everyone in the same bag, because then you ended up with all these confounders, people with chronic stress at personal level, workplace, together with people that have an EBV infection, another one with malaria. The mechanisms might not be the same, the symptoms might be the same. And
but I think from a positive perspective, the fact that you were able to pick up a positive signal with those specific peptides in a very small sample, I think statistically that's very encouraging, and that's really,
yes, it's very encouraging. But we also need to just to be aware of this. I think by chance there was an enrichment of people with EBV infection. Probably because of the referral, right? So they refer these patients to the Charité clinic, and they are aware that if it's an infection mononucleosis, and it could be like a long-term consequences of that, they will send it to that. So I tend to to be cautious, in the sense that I think we were lucky to get this because the patients didn't have very different infections, I think, but I cannot confirm that. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Do we have more time, or can I ask some more questions here?
Still okay. Still okay.
Okay, excellent. I wonder if, so one of the questions was about viral load and how that might affect the antibody levels going forward.
Of course, the beginning of the infection, the viral load will lead to to more production of antibodies, right? So yes, so in a way, if it's an acute infection, this is what it means, right? If the viral load is very high, your immune system will see that, so the production of those antibodies will be higher, okay? Then you have to bear in mind that even that you have very high antibodies, the lab techniques themselves, they have a limitation. So you cannot distinguish, from a mild or moderate infection from a very severe, because the upper limit of the antibody detection is the same. So it won't make a difference, okay? So in the case of the German data, they use the what is called a microarray, and I think the resolution for the antibody responses actually it's higher. And in the first in the first study of the UK biobank, is actually they used ELISA, which is, so the technique is doesn't have so much resolution, so it's very easy to reach saturation of the signal. So in a way, even that the viral loads, it will have an impact on the antibody response. Us, technically in the lab, I think you cannot see them unless you use this high resolution serology tests. Yeah, it's a bit like these RDT tests, right? In coronavirus, right? So if you just need to have a given amount of antibodies so that you have a signal. But if you have 10,000 or 20,000 on 1 million, it doesn't make a difference. So you cannot see that difference. You just see that it's positive. So it's the same idea. So
I see, that makes sense. I wonder if you had a chance to look at any differences between male and female patients, or if you would expect to see any differences.
On top of my head, I don't remember well, but I think I control for gender. So I didn't do subgroup analysis on gender. No, I didn't do that. but I control for that in the analysis. So the signal should be common to both sex. So this is the first thing. In the case of the German cohort, I don't remember if they were only female participants, but I'm not sure. But I don't think so. So, but I didn't, because for me, at least the German cohort, the sample size was not very big. So, and I think maybe it was 50-50. So, but the healthy controls are only 50. So if you partition that, so you get 25 women in the healthy controls, and then you don't have power to see any statistical difference. Does it make sense?
Yes, definitely. Would you maybe expect any differences based on the immune systems of the two genders?
Well, there is an idea that the women have a stronger immune system, right? Because first of all, because of pregnancy, you know, because when they become immunocompromised, they still need to have an immune system strong enough to maintain it. So, so I expect, yes, I expect some differences between men and women, but again, it's boiling down to the resolution of the techniques. Because if the women have consistently, you know, very high antibody levels, but then the resolution of the test is not there, so the men and women will have the same. Okay, so that's why I didn't do any analysis on that, especially on the UK biobank data. Yeah, it's because the analysis of the biobank, the UK biobank data, the objective was not serology. I did that analysis because I was interested in serology. So they use standard, you know, like routine serology assays. That this ELISA, it's, you know, it's been used for all kinds of infections. So. Okay.
This one is a tricky one. I don't know, but I think it might be fairly interesting potentially. So this is about toxic mold and if it could be considered an infection trigger.
Eventually, yes. The immune system recognizes everything. Toxics, exposure to chemicals, it will react to chemicals. That's why you have a vaccine, you have adjuvants, and it's aluminum, right? So eventually, yes, the immune system will react. And this is the beauty of the immune system. It will react to anything that is external to our body. So yes, it could be considered as an infection trigger, but very specific one. I won't say that you will get an adaptive immune system response, right? Because I don't know if mold will evolve so much, but virus evolve. so that I would say that probably is the innate immune system that will recognize these molds, not the antibody, not adaptive. So I mean antibodies. You're not going to see difference.
This is a bit of a long question, but it's from Chris Pringle. So I'll do my best here. Is the theory behind the IgG biomarker theory that the immune systems of the infectious trigger group have had a less effective immune response than the control group?
Well, this is a disease, like I said, disease duration can explain that. So the theory behind that is that over time, the immune system becomes exhausted in a way. So, and then you have a decrease of antibody response. If you go into my pet hypothesis, but this is just pure speculation. Don't quote me on that. Is that I found out that the regulatory T cells actually they are in a way they are increased, and the regulatory T cells they reduce the immune responses and probably including B cell responses. So this could be another mechanism. So over time, the regulatory T cells take over the system, and so that you have an hyper-regulated immune system. So then you cannot produce antibodies. So, but it's pure speculation, and I don't think there is any data that support that. I think it's an interesting, because it's related to what I did in my PhD. So it's related to this the role of regulatory T cells in the orchestration of self, non-self discrimination. So what is components of the body and what is not components of the body. So yeah, so that will be the theory, the two theories. Yeah.
Okay, would you like to ask a question before I go on?
No, but I think we're over time, so we just
Oh.
probably need to wrap up. But if there's any final thought, Nuno, that you'd like to share with us, and next steps, what are your plans for future studies?
The next step is actually we have data on this validation cohort for validation these results, and we are trying. We got funding from another ME association, and we are at the moment we are finishing up the analysis. I can say that some results were confirmed, but some in the UK Biobank there's something still going on. I still don't understand why it's consistently decrease antibody response, when actually I was expecting increased antibody response, especially on these biomarkers for the Ebv. So let's see. Maybe you guys invite me the next time, and I'll try to see what what are the new findings. So the next step, is exactly to understand this validation cohort, what's happening in them. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nuno. That was fantastic, and we hope to invite you again then when your analysis, your results come out.
Sure. It's a pleasure. We are very far away, but at least one of the good things of the pandemics that the distance between me and you guys, it became shorter, so we can do it more often. Excellent. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening, and thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.
Bye.